Gold Trails and Ghost Towns with Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee.
Welcome to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. I'm Mike Roberts, and with me is our intrepid voyager throughout Gold Trails and Ghost Towns of Western Canada, Bill Barlee. Today, though, we're not going to be talking about gold so much as we're going to be talking about copper. A lot of money made in copper at a town called Phoenix. Now, where is Phoenix? Locate us, Bill.
Well, Phoenix, Mike, was in the Boundary Country, and it became the premier copper camp of one of the premier copper camps of Western Canada for about a little over 20 years. And it was a bona fide city. It lasted from 1900 to 1919 when it was closed down, and it produced more value in copper, gold, and silver than all the creeks in the Yukon up to that time.
More. So the gold was in copper in this case.
Well, yeah, it was, and yet the byproduct was gold. They produced about 2 to 3 tons of gold per year, which is the equivalent of about 1 10-pound brick of gold every day of the year. That was just a byproduct. Another 250,000 ounces of silver, and of course virtually a mountain of copper.
Now, in other towns that we've talked about, historic mining towns, you can go to the town and see it, but I haven't heard of that happening with Phoenix particularly.
Phoenix is the only documented case, Mike, where a bona fide, as an incorporated city in Canada, became a ghost town, became less than a ghost town, that it was looted and it virtually disappeared, and then the site itself was mined out. So there's nothing left of Phoenix. No buildings, no streets, not even the site.
Just a hole in the ground.
It's vanished completely.
All right. When we come back, we'll take a look at Phoenix, a wonderful story. It made all its money, not all its money, but a lot of its money in copper. We'll do that right after this break. Welcome back to Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Mike Roberts and Bill Barlee. There were a lot of gold rushes. People rushed to find the gold, but people rushed right by Phoenix, didn't they?
Thousands of miners passed by Phoenix, Mike. They were walking on the Dewdney Trail, which was the most famous of the old gold routes in southern British Columbia. It was established in 1865, so from 1865 to 1891, more than a quarter of a century, literally thousands of prospectors and miners walked right by the site. Now, the Dewdney Trail cut just to the south of a place called Dead Man's Hill, and finally 2 Americans, a guy called Matt Hodder and Henry White, looked at this copper staining, decided to stake it, weren't aware of how valuable their find was. And this shows the old Ironsides and the Nob Hill claims, which was the nucleus of the camp. And these guys sold their claims for a pittance, probably for several $100s, and eventually it found its way into the hands of the Granby Corporation.
And we have right here a check from Granby. So this is one of the first company towns. This is unlike placer mining, where the miners got the money, got the gold and marketed it. This was a company town.
This is true. This was one of the original company towns, something like Copper Mountain. And both, by the way, were owned by Granby.
And it hauled out how much money out of this area in its time?
Almost unbelievable, Mike. The Granby Corporation, in that 20 years, when it really mined Phoenix to its full extent, hauled out more value in copper, gold, and silver than all the gold in the Yukon.
All right. We got a picture here, which is it's a hand-painted postcard. So this was a pretty popular place. People wanted to tell their folks about this, right?
Sure they did. This gives you some sort of view of Phoenix in about 1910.
It's called, there's a phrase, it's one of the highest cities in the land.
Well, sure it is. It was at 4,100 feet, so indeed it was a bona fide incorporated city.
And it attracted how many people? What was its population in its heyday?
At its height, probably 1,500. You'll hear all sorts of figures above that, but there doesn't seem to be any proof for that. 1,500 was very, very close to its top figure.
There are some wonderful characters. The tall man, this is the completion of the phrase. Who's the big guy?
The big guy is W.R. Williams, Willie Williams, the judge in Phoenix. He modestly referred to himself as the highest judge in the highest court in the highest city in Canada. And he was all 3 of those things. He certainly was the highest judge because he was about 6 feet 8 inches tall. It was the highest court because it was the only court in Phoenix. And of course, at that time, Phoenix was the highest incorporated city in Canada.
Over 4,100 feet.
Right.
Now, was he a legitimate judge? Was he a self-appointed judge?
No, he was a legitimate judge. Very interesting character. He liked playing poker. He liked women. He liked liquor, and he was really quite one unusual guy. And the mining town seemed to draw this type of individual.
Yeah, we've got a chit here now. Who would have issued this? Now, what is this about?
That's out of the Canada West collection, and that was issued by his friends in what they called the Tillicums, the Boundary Tillicums, which was a club in Phoenix. So
Is it like the Liars Club or the Kinsmen or something?
Sure, it's
the
a men's
Boundary
club.
Tillicums.
Sure, and they would have a get together, usually once or twice a month, and this is one of their get-togethers in the famous Hotel Brooklyn.
Complimentary dinner to W.R. Williams by his Boundary Tillicums at the Hotel Brooklyn in Phoenix, and this was one in 1907, April the 13th.
Yep.
Think that was a Friday?
Probably, knowing him.
Friday the 13th,
Sure.
1907. All right. Like all towns, this attracted so much business. When did the railway come in here?
Railway came in 1900, fairly early 1900, under Kelly and his road gang. And these are some of the difficulties they had to get past. This is over Dead Man's Gulch, and it shows one of the Columbia and Western trains. And the Columbia and Western, of course, is a CPR subsidiary.
So that was a major engineering feat getting that thing put across.
Oh
there.
yeah, they had to climb to the 4,100-foot level. And they were coming in to tap the copper ore, of course.
Now the locomotive that you see on that trestle is the same locomotive here.
That's 727. That's the same locomotive. That's the Phoenix Express.
And how much ore did it carry out? How can we describe the work the railway did?
Almost unbelievable. The smelter, the Granby Company smelter, was at Grand Forks. And the ore trains that came into Phoenix ran virtually day and night, 24 hours a day, carrying ore back to the smelter in Grand Forks. And they did this for almost 20 years. They carried out a mountain of ore to Grand Forks.
And how far away is Grand Forks from Phoenix?
Well, actually, it would be about 19 miles, I'm thinking, from Phoenix itself. It went down through Hartford Junction, and then down, and then had to cross the kettle at Grand Forks and onto the smelter on the other side. It'd be 19 or 20 miles.
That's a tremendous climb for an ore train. And there were a few mishaps, undoubtedly.
Oh, sure there were. And here's one of the examples. This is a CPR wreck fairly close to Hartford Junction. And there was a fatality in this particular wreck, as you can see. So the CPR did not run uninterrupted for all those 24 years, or 20 years, I should say.
Day and night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Without stop.
For 20 years.
Yep.
The town itself, we haven't had a complete look at it, but this is the shot we opened with. This was the Nob Hill mine.
The old Ironsides and the Nob Hill. They were the nucleus of the camp.
This is a wonderful picture. Is this done with a panoramic camera?
Oh, yes. The original is in the Penticton Museum, and this was loaned to me by them. And it was probably done with a panoramic camera by looking at the original very closely.
And this is not the whole town.
Oh, this is just part of the town. This is a town that had a dozen hotels, had an opera house, had an indoor arena, had a newspaper, had 2 banks, had churches, schools, and two different business districts, New York Division and Lower Town Division.
The Lower Town, of course, is staggering. None of it is there anymore.
There's part of the Lower Town with the famous Brooklyn Hotel in the foreground. And that's completely different from the shot we just saw prior to this.
The Brooklyn Hotel. What can you tell us about that particular establishment?
Well, the Brooklyn Hotel was reported to have the finest cuisine in the West, and indeed it may have. Old Marshall, who ran the Brooklyn Hotel, was a very fine hotel man. And this shows a picture of the Brooklyn, probably about 1910 or 1912, and 3 stories, and had its own monogrammed hotelware, and was really an extremely fine hotel, out of the dozen in Phoenix.
Look at that. You had to be high class to have your own china.
Oh, sure you did. And this is a very rare piece, difficult to get.
Just remarkable. And finding this material is no mean feat, because a town that had come to the end of its economic life was just abandoned.
That's right. Virtually people simply walked away from it, Mike. And you know, it's rather unique in the history of Phoenix itself, which we'll find out as the picture story unfolds.
Yeah. They, of course, if you're a city of any merit, you've got everything that you need, right down to breweries, and as you've already pointed out, all sorts of other facilities.
Oh,
Tell
sure.
me about the brewery.
Well, that was owned by the Biner family, and that was one of the two breweries, but the major brewery in Phoenix itself. And the Phoenix beer was very, very well known. And right now you can see the trouble they went to advertise their wares. And this is the label off one of the beer bottles, and that's difficult to find.
Absolutely pure, contains only malt and hops, Phoenix Brewing Company Limited, and that's a label off one of their bottles.
That's the label off one of the original bottles.
When you establish a city, you establish everything that you need to make it work.
Well, sure. I mean, they had virtually everything they needed in Phoenix. And, well, here's an example. This is the indoor skating rink, and this is the arena in Phoenix. And this is a pretty fair-sized arena for about 1910 or 11.
Now, they didn't have an arena in Sandon, did they?
No, not indoor.
Not in Barkerville?
No.
Not in like Klondike?
No.
These were pretty civilized people. Was
Oh,
there something
sure.
different about this being a company town?
Well, the company town was able to afford these things. So not only did they establish and build the arena, they also brought in a darn good hockey team. And this is a picture of one of the hockey teams, 1911, 1912, picture from the Penticton Museum files. And this team was so good that they actually challenged for the Stanley Cup. Now, their challenge was turned down, but they would have probably done fairly well because the company spared no expense getting the finest hockey players in to play Grand Forks and Deadwood and Greenwood. And Phoenix always had the best team.
And that's a majestic-looking cup they've got there. I mean, who wants to vie for the Stanley Cup when you've got something like that you're working for anyway?
That's right.
Those were the heydays. Of course, time passed, and the next shot we have is, I guess, 1930, City Hall.
Yeah, now we must realize after 1919, the city was abandoned, and the city was abandoned virtually overnight. Antioch, which was the northern operation of the Granby Consolidated, began to ship more copper ore cheaper than Phoenix could. And as the mines in Phoenix got deeper and deeper, there was less gold and less silver, and the copper wasn't as rich. So they finally had to abandon the town. And everyone that realized this realized that they would have to leave the town. And they did leave. They left literally with the clothes on their backs. So then the special trains were sent in to pick up the population, or they walked out of town or went down by stagecoach or rig. Phoenix was abandoned almost overnight. And everything was left there, Mike. The town was simply left intact. So the slot machines were in some of the hotels. The dishes were on the shelves. Some of the tables were still set. The furniture was there, and every building was intact. So it stayed that way from 1919 till about the late 1930s, and finally the salvagers began to move in. And the salvagers took the bricks and took the building materials and the plumbing supplies and then the furniture and so on. And so the town began to be dismantled piece by piece. So this classic ghost town, one of the finest on the Pacific Slope, really became a shadow town. And by the early 1950s, there was very little left. And that shot of the City Hall shows the Phoenix in its declining years. Mm-hmm. And there were only a couple of guys left. And the major individual remaining in Phoenix was the guy who used a mouth organ, and he called himself the self-styled last mayor of Phoenix. It was William Banbury.
We'll talk about him as soon as we come back from this break, because there's just some remarkable stories about treasures. Always there are treasure stories, and we've got a few of those for you when we come back with Gold Trails and Ghost Towns after these words. A harmonica. Is that Mr. Banbury's harmonica?
This is William Banbury's harmonica. Kept him company all those long years.
Tell me about Mr. Banbury's harmonica and him.
Well, Banbury, as we mentioned before, was the self-styled last mayor of Phoenix. He couldn't comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that hit the town.
Yeah.
So he stayed there all those years, waiting for the town to come alive again, waiting for the people he had known to come back. It didn't happen.
That is a lonesome story.
Yeah, it is a lonesome story. But it's kind of interesting, too, because the whole area was kind of shot through with kind of fascinating prospectors. And talking about harmonicas, there was a guy down in Greenwood whose name was Scott McCrae, probably one of the finest prospectors in the Boundary Country, along with Volcanic Brown. And Scott McCrae had one or two claims to fame, and one of them was that he was the originator of Home, Home on the Range. He was the guy who originally wrote the song in the Rio Grande about 1883, but he didn't call it Home, Home on the Range. It wasn't a cowboy song, it was a miner's song. Because if you listen to the words of Home, Home on the Range, you'll see it's a minor song. For seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. This is when a prospector goes out, when he doesn't hear a discouraging word and when there are no clouds in the sky. So this is definitely a minor song, and the cowboys, as Scott McCrae used to say, simply borrowed the song from him.
Was it called Home, Home on the Range by Scott McCrae?
No, he called it the Miner's Lament.
The Miner's Lament.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody quarrel with you on that background?
We're doing a story on it, and we'll probably elaborate on that eventually.
Yeah.
But there's quite a bit of proof, documented proof.
Just the thought of old Mr. Banbury sitting all alone in his town that's abandoned, playing his harmonica. Some of the stories that you've been telling me, you alluded to it in that second segment, and it was about the gambling parlors and the one-armed bandits. You've got one right here. Now, is this one of the slot machines from Phoenix?
This is one of the slot machines from Phoenix, and probably from Angelo Luciani's Butte Hotel. And this was one of the 12 hotels that really ran wide open 24 hours a day. And it is probably the origin of the story when Phoenix was abandoned and Luciani left the town along with all the other hoteliers. But he did leave his hotel intact, and behind the hotel was about a 12-foot section that was blocked off, so that you couldn't tell from walking inside the hotel because it was completely blocked off. It was a false wall, in other words. But in the early 1950s, a guy came into town, and some people, we have the name of this individual, and he was pretty sharp. He looked at the hotel from the outside and walked inside and thought it looked smaller inside. Measured the hotel outside, measured it inside, found it was about 12 feet smaller inside, assumed there was a false wall. Pried off one of the boards in the false wall, looked through, and saw that the room behind was filled with slot machines and roulette wheels and all sorts of gambling paraphernalia.
So the place was abandoned in 1919, and in the 1950s, all this stuff was still there.
Yes, in that particular case. Now, prior to that, Mike, of course, a lot of the stuff had been disappearing piece by piece, as we did mention.
Sure. But just a remarkable, that's like a treasure trove.
Well, sure it is.
Where did all those slot machines end up? In the Canada West collection?
No, unfortunately, I have this one. I'm looking for a roulette wheel right now, which I'll probably get. And but many of the slot machines went down to Spokane. The Americans just came in and picked them up. And
this country is right on the border. I mean, what was the relationship between the Americans and Canadians? I'm never cease to amaze that Canada actually survived those early Americanizations.
Yeah, most of the border towns, Rossland, Nelson, Sandon, Phoenix, Greenwood, a lot of them were populated, heavily populated, by American miners and American promoters.
Yeah. We've always taken a look at these tokens and things like that before, but you mentioned the Luciani Hotel, and we've got a Luciani Hotel token right there from the Butte Hotel, and it's worth 12.5 cents in trade. Now tell me again, why 12.5 cents? What would that equal?
Well, one drink was worth 25 cents. You'd have to have 2 of those tokens to get one free drink from Angelo Luciani's Butte Hotel. Yeah. And very fine. There are only 3 of those tokens known, so this is one of them.
One of 3. The Brooklyn Hotel we've already talked about, a key holder. Where did these things come from?
Those came from the streets of Phoenix. They were actually picked up by the individuals who had gone along the streets in the 1940s and 1950s.
And there's a combination of American coinage and Canadian coinage there?
Probably more American coinage than Canadian coins, that's right.
The Royal Billiard Parlor, Phoenix, BC.
Sure.
And that looks like it would be equal to a coin. I mean, that's not a pot metal thing. That looks like a piece of good coinage.
No, that's a brass coin, and or it's a brass token, I should say. And the tokens were usually aluminum, brass, copper, or German silver, what they call German silver.
Good for 6.25 cents in trade.
And the old Phoenix tokens, Mike, very difficult to find now.
These are treasures. Give me some more treasure stories. I mean, can there be treasure stories around a copper find?
Well, sure. Because the whole boundary country is a fascinating country. You know, the Dewdney Trail cut through it, and there were all sorts of towns in there. There was Camp McKinney, and there was Phoenix, and there was Boundary Falls, and there was Deadwood, and there was Cascade City, and there was Gladstone. So you have a dozen ghost towns in the immediate area. And of course, being a mining area and having mineral occurrences all the way through it, you're bound to get the odd lost mine. There's a well-known lost mine story in the Greenwood area, and it's the lost silver mine at Boundary Creek. And a number of people have That was kept under wraps for many years, Mike, until I wrote it up in my old Canada West some years ago. And it seems to be fairly well authenticated. We know it's some miles up Boundary Creek, beyond Greenwood, and this is silver country. It makes sense, the guy who discovered it. And there were people who searched for that particular mine for about 15 or 20 years. Old Vic Barrett searched for it for almost 2 decades. Never did find it. Found signs of it, but never found the actual tunnel that was supposed to have been driven.
Well, you'd think when you look for a tailings pile, you know that there would be nothing simpler. I mean, what accounts for these disappearances?
Well, remember, a lot of these were very, very small, high-grade properties, especially in the Boundary Country. You had high-grade surface showings, and quite often most of the good gold was on the surface because of oxidization and so on. And, for instance, old man Bombini, old Sam Bombini, who's now deceased, very, very long-time resident of the Greenwood area, he came across a similar occurrence. He was hunting south of Greenwood, somewhere southeast of Boundary Falls, the old deserted community of Boundary Falls. And he wasn't much of a miner, old Sam, but he was an interesting man. And he came across a shaft about 6 or 8 feet deep. This was in the 1930s.
Yeah.
And inadvertently saw what he thought looked like fairly good ore, picked up a couple of samples, put them in his hunting jacket pocket, and wandered home. And eventually, he showed these to a mining man in Greenwood who had the mass say they looked so good, and it was fantastic stuff. Sam went back and looked for the original spot, but the country had been burned over in one of the forest fires in the 1930s. He never did find it. So it simply disappeared. So Sam Bombini's lost mine, which he told me about 15 years ago, and I took the notes on it, is also another very, very fascinating story. And another one we'll probably cover in a later story is the lost Thornton mine, Jolly Jack Thornton's old lost placer mine, which is really quite fascinating.
Jolly Jack Thornton and Volcanic Brown, these characters, that could be a story in itself one day.
Could be a whole series, Mike.
They've got these tremendous names for the miners. The fact that Phoenix completely disappeared, when did that actually happen?
Well, surprisingly, Phoenix died and then it was resurrected again, like the name.
Yeah.
And the company that came back in was Granby again. So they came back in the 1950s, mined it for almost 20 years, and this time depleted the entire ore body, much of which was right under the original site of the old town.
So they just mined out all the foundations, and that was the coup de grace as far as Phoenix was concerned.
Phoenix was completely finished then. Nothing remained. It vanished in its entirety.
Right. One of the most fascinating little artifacts that we've had on these programs is this little miner's lamp. What do you call that?
That's a carbide lamp, and you put water in the top, drip down into the carbide, and then you struck the flint, and it produced a flame. We used them as kids when we were wandering through the mines in, well, I spent many years in Rossland. So this is the type of lamp we used.
And Rossland's the subject of what we're going to be doing next time.
Rossland was the most famous mining camp in British Columbia, bar none. And that's why it was called the Golden City.
We know it only as a skiing center today, but it lasted, and it isn't a ghost town. That must be an unusual circumstance in itself.
It survived, one of the few mining towns that did survive on the Pacific Slope.
Next time, Rossland on Gold Trails and Ghost Towns. Join us.